Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Political Pulse. I'm your host, the one and only, apparently, thank you, Francisco, Josef Goodman. And joining me today are two good friends of mine, Francisco Diez, the former floor leader of the left of the Yale Political Union. He is now squinting weirdly at me. And I'm also joined, he's waving at me, he's so excited to be here, John Aroutiounian, the current floor leader. It's a tongue twister, isn't
That's
it?
That's right.
the current floor leader of the right. So John and Francisco, thank you so much for joining me.
It is an honor, Mr. Goodman.
Well, thank you for inviting us.
Not at all, not at all. So listen, folks, you know how the show is done. You're avid fans, groupies. You know, you've been following the show from the beginning, I can only assume. Religiously, you and the rest of Yale. And you know how the first question always is. The first question is always the classic question. Favorite presidents. And we'll launch into a discussion thereafter. Okay, so who wants to go first? John?
Oh, yeah.
He's raising his hand.
You promised me this, Joseph.
I did promise you this. All right,
go.
so John, what is your favorite president? Who is your favorite president?
So you know, Joseph, this is the only time you're going to hear me say this, but I agree with President Obama. Yes, on this and only this. Well, not only this, but on relatively few things. My favorite president is Abraham Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln.
By far.
By far. Okay, you want to defend that? Because Connor Crawford came on the show a few weeks ago, and he said the exact same thing. So why is Abraham Lincoln your favorite?
Oh, I missed that episode. No, let me...
And you watch it religiously, you say. How can that be?
Oh, lapsed. Let me say that he is, in my mind, just to put this succinctly, the perfect ideal of a pragmatic visionary. I respect that. I respect visionaries, but I respect visionaries who are able to transform their idealism into action. For that, I have a tremendous amount of respect for Mr. Lincoln.
Well, I appreciate that. And Francisco, you over there. You're too quiet.
I would say Lyndon B. Johnson.
Lyndon B. Johnson?
Yes.
What was that, John?
Oh, God.
Oh, God. Okay, you have to say these things louder, all right? If you have something obnoxious, say it into the mic.
Well, obviously this is with qualifications, because I think most American presidents are rather mediocre, historically speaking. Like, just a simple fact. Or at least a simple opinion on my part.
Even Abraham Lincoln? Mediocre?
No, I think Abraham Lincoln, like FDR and LBJ are like some of the exceptions and the actual standouts in American history. LBJ was an extraordinary politician and extraordinarily good at politicking and getting what he wanted done. And the fact that he was able to pass so many things, including like the Great Society, and actually able to expand the American welfare state, saw the decrease of the Gini coefficient like no other president before him. And that, I think, is truly impressive. Because like he actually was able to enact real domestic economic justice in a way that no other president had been able to do so since FDR. But obviously with qualification, because LBJ was absolutely terrible when it came to Vietnam. Like, that's a foreign policy that I can never, ever
have signed on for.
You know, yeah, exactly. And that's obviously one of the reasons why, you know,
by the way, continue. Okay.
Well, this is just my last little bit, is like, this is one of the main reasons why the American left, like, splintered so heavily in 1968. Because they weren't able to unify around anyone.
And I'm going to let you guys speak a bit more, but just to cut you off, sorry about that.
No,
for anyone out there listening to us, my mother, my father, those that follow us religiously. John, I'll let you speak, but I want to let them know that they can comment on my Facebook page and let the people inside this room know what they're thinking outside of this room. So, for example, we're hoping to get some feedback about that LBJ comment. John, speak.
And let me tell you, Mr. Goodman, that I think today, for the first time, well, I'm not sure about that, but for probably the first time, your show has gone international.
Why
because
is that?
I told my Armenian relatives in Yerevan, halfway around the world, Yerevan, the capital of Armenia, to listen in. So today, your show is reaching viewers the other side of the planet, my friends.
Can I tell you the smile that puts on my face, because we look at the map that we have in the room, and it's covered. But there's this hole in the middle. It's like a donut. There is Yerevan, okay? But now we can fill it. Okay, perfect. So listen, I want to thank you once again for coming on. I appreciate LBJ, Abraham Lincoln. You know, people have asked me who my favorite president is, but we're going to say that for the end of the year. You know, the suspense. You know, it's building. It's building. Who do you think it is? It was once upon a time LBJ. I do think, though, that Vietnam is too much of a mistake to really put him as my number one. You know, Vietnam was such a lack of judgment there. He was worried not about the credibility of the United States, but his personal credibility.
Like his entire the entire basis of his judgment was the Cold War, which in and of itself was an incredibly stupid thing. Well, historical event.
True. So he was a product of his
I
circumstances.
can imagine you really liking FDR, Joseph.
You can imagine?
I can imagine.
You know me that well?
Oh, maybe I do.
It could be Calvin Coolidge.
No Calvin Coolidge. I do like FDR, though. I think he was a good president.
Or Millard Fillmore.
Millard. Millard.
Epitome of mediocrity.
Another thing I want to mention out there to the viewers. Last week we had this question. What we'd like to do here at the show is to ask a question to the viewers out there and see if they can answer back. And the first one to answer back will be rewarded one way or another. A back massage from John here. We asked a question last week, who actually wrote The Conscience of the Conservative? And can I tell you, no one responded. I was so disappointed, so upset by this. Are you guys looking for
it?
Francisco's Googling
Cheating.
it.
Absolutely.
The guy who actually ended up writing it, he was a guy by the name of... Who is it? Where is it? I had it on Wikipedia only a few seconds ago. Maybe you do it. Uh-oh. Oh, Brent Boswell Jr. means nothing to me. Absolutely nothing. So maybe perhaps it had just stumped everybody out there, and for that reason alone, no one could answer it. I do have a question for you guys this week, not to be answered by you two, and then we'll get back to the conversation at hand. The question for this week is, which third-party candidate won the largest number of votes? Good question, I think, for people to think about over dinner and breakfast and lunch. Historically, think about Eugene V. Debs. You have a few guesses?
Yeah.
Well, we'll talk about it after the show. All right?
Yeah.
Your reward has been to be invited on the show. So, Okay, so Francisco, I brought you on, and John and I brought you on because you're a lovely fellow, but Francisco, you recently wrote a column in the YDN, the Yale Daily News, about something, and it caused quite a bit of a stir. What was that column that you wrote?
Well, the column was called "Liberals for the Status Quo," and that's coming from a position as someone who has stopped calling himself a liberal, rather explicitly. And when I say liberal, mainly because I believe that that the American liberal tradition comes from the primary tradition of liberalism, which I think is a much more philosophically inconsistent and morally inconsistent view or set of views that I think leftism in a variety of ways, like actual leftism, social democracy, democratic socialism, to some extent communism, and a few other views, are much more consistent and much more able to advocate for a major change in systems that I think are highly oppressive.
John, anything to say? Because you just read the column right before coming on the show.
I did, because I wanted to be able to talk about this with Mr. Diaz and yourself. I think, Francisco...
I love the preparation.
You you paint the problems you're putting forward in the article to be the epitome of modern the problems of modern liberalism. But I really don't know. It's a little ambiguous. I hope you can answer this question. What exactly you want the left to do on this campus? It does a lot. It does a lot to my chagrin sometimes. It does a lot.
But I mean, I think
just to clarify, Francisco, you're coming from the left, and John, you're coming from the right. You're a member of the Federalist Party.
That's right.
And I'm a member.
And you're the member of the Party of the Left, of the YPU.
Yes, yeah. And we were former leaders of, current and former leaders of our respective sides.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so answer the question.
So no, I think you have you have the Yale Democrats, you have organizations like MECHA and the Undergraduate Organizing Committee. That said, I would make a distinction between different types of these organizations based on their ideological leanings, because there's, I think, a real difference between MECHA and the Yale Democrats in the way they approach they're fundamentally their ideologies, right? The Yale Democrats tend to come from a much more American liberal progressivism, progressive views for and vision for the United States, whereas MECHA comes from a much more
What is MECHA?
MECHA is the Latino activist organization on campus, and it's actually part of a much larger federation of student groups that do very similar things. Is coming from a much more critical and, I would argue, leftist point of view. I think the thing is, the right needs to be aware that there are major distinctions between the different groups. I would argue that more progressive groups tend to be much more willing to let things kind of pass by on campus as just kind of a given, right? The whole idea that New Haven happens to be one of the most unequal cities in the country.
You talked about Gini coefficients earlier.
Right. Yeah. This is a problem. At that said, are there major does the majority of campus rise up and try to say something about it? Not really. That's mainly due to much smaller groups actually go about doing this.
But let me defend. This is turning over lots of new leaves today. Let me defend the left a little on this.
Well, you come out supporting Barack Obama, defending the left.
No, you can't just say the left. Because
these groups you are identifying is not doing what you want them to do.
Right. What I want them to do, they can have that from their perspective. I would be able to criticize liberalism
Let me say that I think it's more of an emblematic problem of the entire campus as opposed to any one group or another.
I would agree with that. I think college students in general are just pretty apathetic.
I would really like to see homelessness in this town tackled on a much more fundamental level as well.
Right.
I want to see the people on the corner of Abampan spoken to and helped, as opposed to just pass by them every day and eventually ignore them. So those are problems. But let me also point out one more thing in the article that I was a little befuddled by. You say
befuddled, good word.
Thank you. You say, I acknowledge that the conservative movement has tremendous resources, but I believe the challenges faced by liberalism is something more deeply problematic. You do acknowledge the vast resources that the movement on the left has and will have, especially in this election this year, right?
Okay, but here's again, you're fundamentally working again under a paradigm of assuming the way the American ideologies work. I don't work under that paradigm because I refuse that's actually okay. I refuse to say that's okay, right? When I say the left, I'm not talking about Barack Obama. To me, Barack Obama is a moderate, right? The reality is that he's not even from before the election, he was a lukewarm liberal. And barely even not even close, halfway to a social democrat from the center.
Well, the system moderated him. I think he's much farther.
He just couldn't get a public option through Congress, so he was forced to settle for what he got.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but even the idea of a public option is not actually seriously isn't taken seriously by even basic social democrats. Social democrats argue for universal healthcare. Period.
Francisco, I think
don't make room for that.
I think you will eventually have to acknowledge that this country just isn't as far left as you want it to be.
Right, and that's exactly why I seriously consider expatriation.
Have you really? Really? Where would you move to?
Mexico.
So not Paris. Because that's where they were all chilling back 80, 90 years ago.
Well, the reality is that Europe
There's a socialist country over there. You'd fit in well.
No. Well, that's also a terrible misjudgment of Mexican politics.
No, I'm talking about the French.
Oh, the French don't have a socialist government right now. Nicolas Sarkozy is not a socialist.
Sure, but it's a pretty socialistic country. They have socialist tendencies. Actually,
they have enacted social democracy as the economic system.
There was a great graph in The Economist this week that showed how the favorability of attitudes of different countries, and they asked different people in the United States, Canada, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom how they viewed the free market. And France had less than 30% favorability towards the free market.
Right, because the whole idea of calling it a free market, it shouldn't be called the free market, it's capitalism. That's fine. Capitalism is very productive and can be used very well.
But it shouldn't be called the free market?
No, because that's under a one, if you want to talk about negative liberties and call it freedom, go ahead. Call that, but free market isn't necessarily a propagandist tool by which to advocate for capitalism as a positive good.
John?
Well, hold on. Hold your horses. I think with reference to the poll numbers you're citing, Joseph.
Do you also see that?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Obviously, France is in the midst of an election. It's in the midst of an economic slump. I think a lot of what you're seeing also has to do with dissatisfaction with the way things currently are, as opposed to a deep-rooted philosophical belief about the nature or supposed evils of capitalism.
But even then,
so I wouldn't trust those numbers that intuitively.
I should fill the Economist graph out.
Right, but that said,
it's a good publication. Yeah, John,
European social mores are significantly farther on the left. Fundamentally, than American social morals.
That's true. I mean, even the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom, for example, would be Democrats here in the United States.
David Cameron would be a moderate Democrat. Right. Exactly. That's the reality. I'm totally fine with that. That said, out of all the European nations that's most likely to become closer to the U.S. is probably Britain. Probably because of its the liberal structure to its welfare state.
Do you really think that's true, Francisco? The Conservative Party would be the Democratic Party here?
No. I'm not saying all conservatives. I'm just saying David Cameron, who happens to be on the left wing of his party, would be much more likely to be I've heard this from many from several British conservatives is that they would probably say yes. And I've also heard that from various members of the Labour Party in Britain, is that they would also say that David Cameron would probably be in the Democratic Party.
I think he would.
I mean, like, the fact is that he's
agree, John?
extremely reluctant to cut down, like, to completely get rid of NHS.
Right.
That's a political impossibility.
Exactly.
Right, which is fantastic. Like, honestly.
We should never develop, let me just say on that point, we should never develop leviathans of the size that we can never tear it down through political will. And the fact that NHS has developed into that kind of a monolith is very dangerous.
I'm going to come to the defense of the NHS here. The National Health Service, all right?
Yeah.
Provide more healthcare to more people at a cheaper cost than we do in this country.
That may very well be the case.
You're worrying about the Leviathan, this whole hypothetical, like, dangerous bureaucracy that's taking away all of our freedoms, which is, like, necessarily to some extent may be the case. I'm willing to concede that. But that said, like, the positive freedom that a national health service gives, like, philosophically, far outweighs any sort of, like, cut to our negative liberties. That's something that I will, like, fight tooth and nail with libertarians on any given day.
Do you have anything else to say on David Cameron? I find him a fascinating fellow. He recently just came to the United States here. Are we fans in this room?
I
actually am kind of okay with him.
Okay,
the reality is, like, obviously I don't agree with what he's doing and the way he's trying to make, the welfare state smaller.
Britain is still in a recession there.
Right, but, like, that said, you take away the welfare state, let's just bring us back to, like, macroeconomics 101, right? Mm-hmm. Like, if you want to enact basic Keynesian policy, basic fiscal policy to deal with, like, a recession, the last thing you want to do is cut down on your welfare state. That said, you're also dealing with lots of austerity problems, right, in Britain, which is a whole nother issue. That said, like, yet again,
but I would argue, like, the way you come to David Cameron's defense, knowing that he's cutting down, knowing that he's cutting down during a year.
Right, but the reality is that I don't think he's doing that much. Like, I may be completely wrong, and I'm sure I will learn this because I'm about to become one of his enemies in Parliament this summer. Right, when I
are you interning there this summer?
Yeah, I'm interning with
a Labour MP.
Yeah,
very
David
cool.
Lammy from Tottenham, and so
David, shall we say
David Lammy?
David Lammy out there. Just saying hello here from the Political Pulse.
There's a reason why the Liberal Democrats sided with the Tories this time around. It's because they knew there was no political will, that they would get massacred in the next election if they sided with a failed ideology.
Well, it's not about failed ideology. It's simply about pragmatics. Let's think about it, right? Like, the Lib Dems have slightly a bit of a different view on... Am I right, Joseph? You probably are a lot more familiar with British politics right now than I am. Like, the reality is, like...
Very well might be the case.
Right. Yeah. But, the Liberal Democrats are also coming from a different, like, ideological strain, which is actual liberalism, which is, like, okay. Particularly their liberalism, because it's social liberalism and not, like, well, never mind.
And also, you've got to take into account how Tony Blair sort of changed the direction of the Labour Party.
Right, absolutely. I mean, prior to Tony Blair in 1997, the New Labour, they were actually a socialist party.
Very different now.
They're very different now. Right. They're a liberal party.
We'll see what Ed Miliband does with it. Or is it
one because
of the
there's
brothers?
Ed.
Ed or David?
No, David was the one booted out.
Right. So Ed Miliband. We'll see what he does with it. I hope he doesn't take it back into the direction of pre-Tony Blair days.
Right, but what I'm trying to get to the bottom of, Francisco, here, is how you can possibly support David Cameron on the one hand, in light of all that you've been talking about for the past 15 minutes.
I never said I supported him, like, ideologically. I said I was kind of okay with him. Like,
but
he's
how
a charismatic.
Could you be?
Well,
he's as a person or
like
as a leader?
As a person, he's interesting. Like, he's an interesting figure, and the fact is, on his foreign policy, I probably agree with him more than I agree with Barack Obama.
Not a bad transition to make. You want to delve a bit into foreign policy here?
I mean, like, why not?
Okay, so talk a bit about David Cameron's foreign policy.
He went to the White House partly to try to convince Barack Obama that action needs to be taken on Syria, right? Well, the reality is that the civil war going on in Syria is presenting such a
intervention?
A human rights catastrophe.
Francisco, do you consider yourself to be part of the interventionist left?
I think so, to some extent, yeah.
You do.
Like, and I think it's necessary to take context really seriously.
So you empathize with the reasoning behind going into Iraq, or part of it?
No, I do not.
Really? Because some of the arguments used back then were, we have to take out...
Right, but those arguments were based on faulty intelligence.
Oh, come on. You and I didn't know that then. And hindsight is 20/20, and I think it's disingenuous.
Right,
for me
but
to
there's
say
a
that
difference
now.
between the civil war going on in Syria right now and the rebellion that's going on
But
in
I'm
Syria
saying
right
you ought
now.
to be sympathetic towards some of the arguments that were used in the run-up to the Iraq War.
Right, but like there was
Francisco
a
here is
difference
not
between like
advocating for a full-out invasion and occupation, what
Right,
occurred
right,
in Iraq in
and
2003.
and beyond that, like what happened in Iraq, it was obvious to the rest of the
This
world.
is so heated, guys. I'm
to
loving
the
this.
rest of
Continue.
the world, right? Like all other major intelligence agencies were not saying exactly the same thing. Here, there is not a shred of doubt.
Right,
what
pretty much
is
everyone
going
is on the
in-
same page here.
on
Absolutely.
Syria, right? Like,
No, I
and
fully
obviously
agree
it's
with
going to
you
be a bit confuddled because, like, one, like whenever dealing with like any sort of foreign intervention in the Middle East or anywhere, right, is always going to go in with like extremely Western, like over assumptions and oversimplifications about the situation.
Absolutely.
That said, like the fact that like over 9,000 people have been killed and are being continually
Listen,
being massacred
I
and like
agree.
economically cut down. Like I think something ought to be
Okay,
done.
but you're Barack Obama right now,
Yeah.
okay? And Tony Blair just come to you. What did Tony Blair actually ask for,
Tony Blair.
about Syria?
You mean
No,
David
oh my God,
Cameron?
not Tony Blair.
Right.
David Cameron. What did he ask for?
Like as far as I understand, like support, like
For a multilateral
like
Disarmament of Bashar al-Assad.
yeah, as far as I understand.
And John, you wouldn't be down for this?
I would be very wary. I would read over this plan again and again and again. I think we have seen time and time again American intervention go awry. We saw it with Iraq. We saw it. You know, this has been a
Right,
narrative.
right.
It
throughout
worked. It
American
worked well
history.
in Libya, though, didn't it?
Oh, I'm not so sure about that. Joseph.
Really?
I don't.
Did you read that? Yeah.
Let's not count our chickens before they hatch. We will see what kind of a government eventually, a stable government eventually overtakes this
Right.
regime.
But think about it, right? Gaddafi overthrown, a man who was brutally murdering his own people, like what
Right.
we see happening in
Right.
Syria. This was a multilateral decision. Britain, France, the United States, the kind of multilateralism that Ambassador Eikenberry loves to talk
Yeah.
about, that we want to see
Right.
moving forward in the
There
21st century.
There are intricacies in the Middle East that we cannot purport to understand today.
So,
Right,
so you
exactly.
think there are intricacies in Syria that were just not the case in Libya?
That's probably the case.
Like Turkey, like Iran.
Turkey, you know, I mean,
Like,
Syria finds itself
Israel.
so much closer to exactly other spheres of influence. It's going to be a hotbed for years and years to come.
Okay,
And
so
I
you're in the
think-
Oval Office, and you would be very wary of.
especially if it comes to an American arms commitment. I would be very wary because then, Joseph,
Drones? I mean, it's hard to make any of these foreign policy
Right,
decisions because
exactly.
you don't have
but
the
like
numbers.
the reality
and
is like is that much of a change to what
But-
we already do in the rest of the
but
world?
Francisco,
No, not really.
What if we?
I mean,
put-
the United
let
States.
Francisco talk
The
here.
United States is already basically an imperial power, and there's no way you're going to deny
I
that.
agree.
Like, right? Like,
you would agree with that,
I agree.
but perhaps a good empire.
no.
No,
better than most.
not a good empire, Francisco. You know, it was Robert Kagan who said how you can judge a country's foreign policy like you judge baseball. If you fail 70% of the time, you still make it to the Hall of Fame. And I would argue that the United States, more than any other empire in history, has a pretty good batting average. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, but kind of, right? Like I will admit, like the American military can be like one of the greatest forces for good on Earth, mainly because it's able to provide so much aid to so many places that are suffering. That said, does it
That's
do
all
anything?
changing, though, isn't it now, folks? Right? Obama announced only recently that
The
the two-war doctrine has officially come to an end.
Or R2P. We haven't talked
Well,
about
right,
R2P
right, but I'm
yet.
not
We'll get to
but,
that, John, but
Joseph,
continue,
I'm not even
Francisco.
talking about like Afghanistan or Iraq.
Okay.
I'm just talking about like basic hospital aid, like for example, that the Navy
Oh, I
provides
see.
to like many places that are already impoverished and in need of help and basic medicine. You know, like they are able to provide that to Southeast Asia very well. You know, when that's actually called for, and in when like international natural disasters happen, right? Like that is why I think like the American military can sometimes.
So that's a single, that's a double,
Right.
that's a triple, that's a home run.
Sure, but I don't even watch
A hit.
baseball, so like I don't care.
You're Mexican, you watch soccer. Foosball, no?
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
But that said, like is the the American empire, just for what it does on the domestic sphere, is disgusting. Like absolutely
You
disgusting.
mean at home here in the United States?
Right. The development of the military-industrial complex over the past 50 years, what it has done to reinforce the immense power that corporations have in the United States government, I think is absolutely atrocious and unjust. Right. But let alone that's just one part of one part of why I don't think the American system works particularly well, nor can it work for very long,
John,
much
you
in
must
the
have
future.
something to say here.
Listen, I think we would be extremely, we would be sticking our heads in the sand if we didn't acknowledge that there have been countless mistakes in American foreign policy, and there have been countless times, as Francisco's pointing out, where it's given way to exploitation. But America, Joseph, and I will fight tooth and nail for this against my dear friend Francisco, is more willing to transfer its wealth to countries that need it. Is more willing to.
That's actually factually incorrect.
Is more willing.
What do you mean by that, Francisco?
I mean, like, when you look at the actual like
claim.
Yeah.
John, finish your claim, and then we'll get to Frankie.
America has been, one of the world's leaders when it comes to transferring wealth to other countries. It leads the West.
It does when it gives oil money all the way to Saudi Arabia and etc.
Right.
Is that what you mean, or not so much?
Not so much. I'm
but actually, oil money, we're seeing the largest transfer in history.
That was a T. Boone Pickens line for a while.
The big
oil
I think, listen, a lot of the stuff that I say in the Political Pulse originates from T. Boone Pickens. But I just want to say one thing, Francisco, and that is this. When it comes to the American empire, when it comes to Robert Kagan's rubric for grading foreign policy, not one empire in all of history, talk about the British, talk about the French, talk about the Soviets, talk about the Mongolians, Alexander, not one empire sacrifices so much for so noble a cause as Americans right now in Afghanistan. Just take a look at Afghanistan and the history of Afghanistan.
Oh my goodness, that sounds like an gross, disgusting oversimplification of the reality
of
the history of empire.
Think about it,
right? Like the way we interact in Afghanistan is one with immense ignorance towards the actual culture that exists there, and the reality that we can't actually shape this culture to form a simple Western parliamentary democracy. That's not actually going to happen the way we conceive of it.
Okay, but that is no longer even the goal here. The goal here is to leave Afghanistan stable.
Which is not going to happen.
Which might happen, who knows. But the point is this, that if you take a look at Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires, Alexander the Great invaded, the Mongolians invaded.
Becoming our graveyard, thank goodness.
Right, it's a whirlpool that's sucking in American resources. But America, unlike any of the past invaders of Afghanistan, doesn't invade it to subjugate it or to dominate it, but to make it better, to redeem it in a way, to leave it more like the Soviets didn't invade in 1979 for the kind of goals that we're going in there for. We don't want it to be a safe haven for Al-Qaeda, a noble goal. No other empire in history has ever come close to such a noble goal in Afghanistan. John, what do you have to say?
Well, and in that regard, it also serves our national interest, right? And I'm a big believer in America.
It probably doesn't cost $100 billion a year, I would say, but yeah.
America obviously has to take care of itself first, as any nation in this world does too. It has to look after its national interest. But America has a special role to play in the world because of its superpower status, as not necessarily a world police, but some kind of a guardian. Absolutely. And this is what we prove, that when we take commitments, we own the commitments. We've owned it in Afghanistan. There's tremendous debate in this country about whether or not we should continue our involvement there for humanitarian reasons and for our personal security reasons. But we own the conflicts we enter. We do not go in and let countries, fall apart.
Well, we're about to.
Explain, for instance.
Iraq?
I mean, I have no idea how Iraq is necessarily going to happen. How is it going to turn out? That said, I mean, we have left other countries fall apart, right? We've left Vietnam to fall under the communist control.
We lost.
79 we leave, 75.
Right. But even then, we didn't even say we lost the war. We just kind of left. Right? This is what's this is what's happening now. We're not obviously seeing the same rise in death tolls. That said, what is Hamid Karzai, right? Is he actually the fact that there's such immense levels of corruption, the whole idea of him even being somewhat in any way, shape, or form a legitimate leader in Afghanistan is ridiculous. And beyond that, I want to get back to one point. I want to get to one point that I referred to earlier, right?
Sure. Guys, we only have a minute left, so you got to be one quick.
Okay, so the point about giving, right? The amount that Americans give, on whole, yeah, great. More than most other countries
in absolute terms,
right? In absolute,
I'm glad
but relative to per capita, right? You see countries like Denmark, France, Germany giving much more per
Since
capita.
these are countries you would like, Francisco.
I do like them a lot, and I think that's great.
Francisco, context. Hamid Karzai is the closest thing to a national leader as fractious and as geographically unstable a country as Afghanistan has ever had. We need to view things in context, and when we do...
Right, but that's because the
don't allow
whole
the
idea of the
perfect-
nation state is
it's-
wrong.
Guys.
It's easy to criticize, but when we view things in context, America has played an outsized role in being a defender of what's right and just in the world.
And fellas, we're going to have to
Wrong.
leave off with that. But before we do, I want to just thank Elias Kleinbuck out there, who has been typing away on our Facebook comment page incessantly over the past 30 minutes. So Elias, thank you so much.
I love you, Elias.
I have taken notice of you and your presence there on Facebook.
You're my biffle, Elias.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us for another wonderful installment, I would say wonderful, of the Political Pulse. John, Francisco.
You're the best, Joseph Goodman.
It was a pleasure having you.
It was fun.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me next week. I can't tell you who our guests are going to be then, but I can tell you it's going to be just as exciting. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Have a good night.
Good night.